Well, welcome to another beautiful day at my outdoor studio at Richie's Roost in Shaco, Mississippi. We got a little wind this morning, so you may have a little wind noise, but just try to ignore it. Now, when you and I have had the occasion to get together in the past, I've introduced us to some remarkable people whom you may not have met. And there'll be more of them that I plan to introduce to you in the future. And I've told a lot of stories and passed on to you some information that about things you might not have thought about. But today's going to be a little different. Now, some of y'all are retired folks with a little more time to try activities you may not have been able to try in the past. Others, whom I greatly admire, like to stretch and find the time to accomplish tasks that they just want to do. And whatever your status is, I thought we'd talk about something you might cogitate on. Have you ever considered volunteering to teach an adult to read? Now, there's a real need for this. And there's a mistaken belief that these grown people who can't read are stupid, dumb, just never could learn to read. But in the words of Louis Grizzard on more than one occasion, au contraire. Now, I've had the privilege of teaching some adults to read, and there have been success and failure. And I'd like to go over a couple of case studies with you just to give you an idea of what that kind of thing is. Now, I read not too long ago, give you an idea, maybe the mental capacity of some of these folks, that there was a very successful contractor in the contracting business in California. Unbeknownst to the rest of the world, he owned the company, but he couldn't read. He was able to hide this from his secretary and everybody but his wife. You know, contracting business involves a lot of long contracts and a lot of verbiage in there, but he would feign terrible headaches and have his secretary read those contracts to him because his head just hurt too bad to try to read. And he remembered the verbiage in those contracts, obviously. I was privileged to know another man. He's gone now, but he was a senator from Vicksburg, Mississippi. His name was Ellis Beaudron. He was blind, so obviously he couldn't read. But he was a senator in the Mississippi legislature, and he was on some high-ranking committees. One of the biggest ones was the executive or budget commission. All he had to do was hear a number, and he could remember it better than anybody with pages in front of him. So if you don't have one skill, many times the others are sharpened because you don't have it. And that's generally the case with the folks who can't read. Now, I'm going to talk about two of the folks that I did get involved with. The first was not a real success. He was a young, in his 30s, white fella. We'll call him Jerry. And I don't use last names. Jerry had a family, small child actually, his wife and small child. But he never learned to read. Stopped school early. I don't remember why. It probably had something to do with a family condition. But he was on the list, and by the way, you find these folks who don't want to take lessons in a classroom because they're embarrassed to admit to a lot of people that they can't read, so they only respond to the possibility of learning individually. And most churches or other organizations like that have a list of people who maybe need that attention. And that's where mine came from. A list on a little Catholic church here in Canton, Mississippi. And we met for 1 hour each week on a Monday night at the church hall in the Episcopal Church in Canton. Every Monday night for an hour. He lasted about a month and a half, I guess. And then he decided that he just didn't have time to do it anymore, so he stopped. And I hated that because he was a bright young man. He was a shipping clerk, folks. Now think about that. He had to have all the names and addresses and the street numbers and so forth to be able to ship the products from his company. But he was able to memorize what those addresses looked like so that when so-and-so company, the ABC company, needed something, he went straight to the A's. He did know that. And scanned it until he saw something that looked familiar, and that was the correct address. And he didn't make mistakes. I took him a dictionary, bought him a little pocket dictionary, took it to him and told him that maybe that would help. And he confessed to me that he didn't know his, quote, ABCs, so the dictionary wouldn't be any help to him. He didn't even know the alphabet. That was the failure. Then we move on to a 50-some-odd year black man named Roosevelt. Roosevelt never learned to read because he came from a very poor family, lots of children. His clothes were never good enough, he thought, to be able for him to go to school and not be embarrassed by them. So he dropped out early, and never learned to read. Roosevelt was a diesel mechanic. Now think about that for a minute. Manuals that come with big diesel machines. He couldn't read. Schematics, he could follow those, but he was an expert diesel mechanic. I asked him when we got together, first of all, Roosevelt, what do you want to do? What do you want to accomplish? He said, I want to be able to read little books to my grandchildren, and I want to learn to read the Bible. I said, oh, let's go. We met every Monday night at that little church for the better part of a year. He hung with it. I took him to the library. We got a library card. He would get little books, little children's books. He and I would go over them. And what he couldn't read, he could remember, so that he could sit with children in his lap and tell them the story as opposed to reading it. But he told it to them word for word out of those books. Very bright. Then, toward the end of that year, he was becoming pretty capable. I took the Bible took my Bible to the church and said, "Tonight, Roosevelt, we're gonna read the 23rd Psalm," which I knew he probably knew by heart anyway, because he'd gone to church all of his life. So we started. The Lord is my shepherd. And when he'd stumble over a word, he'd stop and think and remember from memory, and then he would say it. And he got through it, 23rd Psalm. And I said, "Well, Roosevelt, you told me you wanted to be able to read to the children, read the Bible, and you just read the Bible for the first time out loud." He said, "No, sir." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Last Sunday morning, from the pulpit, I read to the congregation from the Gospel of John." I cannot tell you how I felt at that moment. I never scored a touchdown in a championship game. I never hit a home run in a championship game. But the feeling was much the same. If you can, think about it. There is no feeling like being able to say to yourself, "I made a difference in that person's life." I hope you'll think about that, and if you are so inclined, see what you can do to maybe change somebody's life. I'm Jim Ritchie. I'll see you again next time.